Welcome this evening to our very special program. Hope everybody's well and not tired of me yet. We have a couple more weeks to go. But it is my high honor and privilege. Marilyn, I'm going to mute you right from the start here. She just disappeared. So that we're introducing the speaker. So there'll be time for questions afterwards. Welcome to everyone. Hope you're ready for an exciting hour. We don't often get a chance to speak with people who have helped shape our country's past, particularly people kind of behind the scenes. I think you're going to be very impressed with the story you're going to hear. Of all the people I've read about in the last year or so of researching stuff about FDR, the story of Missy LeHand, I think, is one that everyone needs to hear. She was, for all intents and purposes, the first female chief of staff in the White House. She certainly helped shape things going on in the White House and the governor's office before that. And we've talked a little bit about her when President Roosevelt was first stricken with polio and the role she played in helping him recover as best he could and keep his focus on what was important. So I am extremely excited and honored to introduce to you all this evening Miss Missy LeHand. Miss LeHand, take it away.
Greetings to all of you lovely folks in Maine. Thank you so much for the orchids you sent. I felt so special when I received them today. Mrs. Roosevelt always has on the most marvelous orchid corsages, and I've got one of my own now. So thank you so kindly, so sweet and thoughtful of you. Well, the president sends his good wishes from Washington. Even though you were one of the very handful of states who did not support him in the election, he has no hard feelings about that. But we do hope that we are doing things that please you and are helping you during this Great Depression as we work on our New Deal together. Well, I'm going to tell you about a few of the things we've been doing, but I thought I would just tell you a bit about myself and how I became the first woman presidential secretary in U.S. history. How many of you, like me, are of Irish descent? Could I see some hands? Anyone of Irish descent? Oh, I see a hand. Okay, I see another one. All right, very good. Well, perhaps like you, my forebears came over during the Irish potato famine, and perhaps some of yours did too. It was such a terrible time that anyone who could get out of Ireland without dying did so, and so many of them died during the crossing that they were called coffin ships. They just threw the poor dead Irish people overboard into the Atlantic Ocean as their graveyard. But my grandparents did survive the journey. They made it to Potsdam in upstate New York, where they settled and married, had my father, Daniel. And my grandfather was working on a building project. He was working on the roof at the Methodist church there in Potsdam, and a hatchet fell on his head and killed him. Well, my poor grandmother never remarried, and that left my father as that most unusual of characters, an only child in an Irish Catholic family. Well, my parents had 4 children. I'm the youngest of the 4. And when I was a very small child, even though I was born in Potsdam, we moved to a section of Boston called Somerville. Sort of a blue-collar neighborhood there, lots of Italians, lots of Irish, lots of Catholics, some Greeks. And that is probably a place you've never heard of, but I bet you have heard of the adjoining community of Cambridge. And what do we know that's in Cambridge? Institution of Higher Learning? Anyone?
Harvard.
You can answer if you'd like. It's Harvard. It's Harvard. And who do we know in the White House who went to Harvard?
FDR.
Well, Mr. Roosevelt, of course. So to make ends meet, when I was growing up, my mother sometimes took in Harvard students as boarders, but she never took in Mr. Roosevelt. That was in 1902. When he graduated. Well, I grew up in Somerville, knowing that I would need to make my own way in the world and that careers for women were fairly limited. I studied shorthand and office management practices and the like. When I graduated in 1917, we had just entered the Great War under the leadership of Mr. Woodrow Wilson, the president then, and wanted to do my bit for my country. I took the civil service exam and I went to Washington, D.C. to work at the Department of the Navy. Well, I was working in an area of top secrecy, and all day long they would give me sheets of paper to type. They were in shorthand, so I had to transcribe the shorthand and then type it. And all day long I was typing, and none of the sheets of paper had anything to do with each other. So I would get one thing, I'd type it, the next had nothing to do with it, and the next had nothing to do with any of that. So I had no idea what I was typing, but I knew that every evening I would go home, my back aching, my shoulders aching, my head pounding. Well, after about 3 weeks of that, my roommate at the boarding house, who was working in the same area, suggested that we play hooky. It was a beautiful spring day, much like this one. So we sent word to the office that we were ill, and we went out to visit the home of the father of our country, George Washington. Well, we had a wonderful time, and then when we got back to our boarding house, there was a Navy nurse sitting on the steps, and she said, "You don't look sick to me." Well, we got into terrible trouble. We both had to go to the Navy doctor for physicals, and unfortunately for my girlfriend, there was nothing wrong with her, but he detected that I had a heart murmur, which was related to a case of rheumatic fever that I had a few years before that, and they suggested that maybe a less strenuous job was in order. So I was sent to Philadelphia to the work for the Emergency Shipping Board. So I never saw Mr. Roosevelt during that time because he was the assistant secretary in Raleigh, named Josephus Daniels. Just a little tidbit of information, nothing about ships. He called them all boats. He didn't know anything about the Navy, other than that he wanted to abolish sin in the Navy. And if you've ever met a sailor, you know what a tall order that was. So the first thing he did was to ban anything stronger than coffee in all of the officers' messes, the Navy bases, the ships everywhere. And that's why to this day, we refer to a cup of coffee as a cup of Joe, after Josephus Daniels. Well, he was lucky to have Mr. Roosevelt as his assistant because he was very knowledgeable about ships. He had almost an encyclopedic knowledge of boat shipping, naval warfare history. His hero is John Paul Jones. So he was quite a great help. Well, a few years later, in 1920, Mr. Roosevelt had been selected as the running mate of James M. Cox, who was seeking the presidency on the Democratic Party ticket. And I got a letter from a Mr. Charles McCarthy, who I had known in the Navy Department, asking me if I would please come to Manhattan and help out at their office. So I didn't have anything else to do, really, and this was August, and the election wasn't all the way until November. It was a very, very long campaign. Can you imagine? So I took him up on his offer, went to 23 or 24 steps, all the way down to the headquarters in Manhattan. Well, it was a very tough year for the Democrats, as you might recall. Everyone was sick of Woodrow Wilson, the Great War, the League of Nations. So Mr. Cox and Mr. Roosevelt really didn't have much of a platform to run on. And that's how we wound up with Warren G. Harding as our president, and then Calvin Coolidge as his vice president. Now, I have spent a lot of time down south at the little White House in Georgia, and they had this wonderful expression in the South that goes, "Bless his heart." You can say anything about anyone as long as you say, "Bless his heart" or "Bless her heart" after. So Mr. Warren G. Harding if he had not died in office, bless his heart, I think would be remembered as the worst president in U.S. history up until today. But he did die in office, and that made us have Mr. Coolidge come in. Now, about the time Mr. Harding died, all the scandals involving his presidency came bubbling to the surface. The Teapot Dome scandal, his attorney general was indicted twice on prohibition issues. He did survive by the skin of his teeth, but Mr. Coolidge quickly dismissed him. And then, so we had Mr. Coolidge as our president, and basically he went to the White House, pulled down the shades, and slept for 5 years. He was known as Silent Cow. One time he was sitting next to a woman at a dinner party, and she said she bet that she could get him to say more than 2 words. He looked at her with those beady little eyes, looked down at his plate and said, "You lose." Well, I shouldn't speak ill today. He did pass away last year. How they could tell, I really don't know. It'd be some time before he could make a political comeback and try to become elected president again. So he decided to take a job on Wall Street, serve as his private secretary. One trained in stenography who hoped to become a secretary is to be the powerful secretary to a powerful and well-placed gentleman like Mr. Roosevelt. But even so, I hesitated just a bit because he's a lawyer. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to work for a lawyer, even on Wall Street, because I found the law very dull. And he said to me, "Oh, Missy." Now, let me explain how I went from being called Marguerite to Missy. The Roosevelt children, the younger ones, had a hard time saying Miss LeHand, and it just kind of slurred into Missy LeHand, and before long, just about everyone called me Missy. So I said, "Oh, Missy, don't worry, there'll be lots of other things to do." So I took the job, and I was glad I did, because there were lots of other things to do. He was very active in the Boy Scouts of America, for example, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and then he was trying to resuscitate the Democratic Party. And I got so good at the law work, I started getting mail addressed to Marguerite LeHand, Esquire. Well, all that came to a crashing halt in the summer of 1921. I'm sure as residents of Maine, you all know what happened. He went up to join his family on Campo Bello Island off your coast, where they had had a home for many years. And there he was stricken with poliomyelitis. We call it that, or we call it infantile paralysis, which is a very tough thing for a man who's 39 years old and stands several inches over 6 feet. But that was Mr. Roosevelt's fate. He was paralyzed, it affected his legs, and for a long time, he fought in every way he could to be able to walk again. He wasn't having much success until the summer of 1924, when he heard from an old Harvard classmate from Georgia, George Fast Peabody, about this place in Georgia called Warm Springs. There is an old Victorian inn there, the Meriwether Inn, and a young man who had been affected with polio had been exercising in their warm water pool, fed with magnesium water, 88 degrees year-round, and he found after a period of time that he could walk with just a cane. And Mr. Roosevelt, of course, was quite intrigued with that, because he wanted to do the same thing. So in October of 1924, he packed me, his wife Eleanor, and there also his valet, Roy Jones, who helped him get about with all his personal needs, on the train. And we went all the way from New York City down to the piney woods and cotton fields of Middle Georgia. Well, it was a bit of a shock, I have to say. Warm Springs was 10 miles from the nearest paved road. There was not much electricity, and what there was quite expensive, not much running water, not much telephone service, really not much of anything. I think, though, for poor Mrs. Roosevelt, the last straw was the day that we went to get some chicken for supper, and she discovered we had to buy the chickens on the hoof. Well, we bought the chickens back in the car, clucking and squawking, gave them to the cook who prepared them for dinner. Mrs. Roosevelt witnessed the chicken execution, and she just did not enjoy her dinner that night at all. She couldn't eat a bite. In fact, she said it was just too personal. And the next morning, as we were having our coffee, she said to me, "Oh, Missy, suppose Franklin wants steak for dinner tomorrow night. Whatever shall I do?" I guess she thought that he would. Okay, I made that part up about the steak. The chickens is true, but Mrs. Roosevelt did have a lot to occupy her back in New York, so she got back on the train and went back up there. Mr. Roosevelt, meanwhile, was loving Warm Springs. He was exercising for hours every day in the warm water pools, and he became convinced that he had stumbled onto a great treatment for polio. So he gave an interview to a reporter from the Atlanta newspaper saying he planned to swim his way back to health. And we went back up north for Christmas. And when we came back to Warm Springs the following March, there were a bunch of polio patients waiting for us there. Well, they had no doctors, no nurses, just FD and me. Didn't stop him. He just made himself Old Doc Roosevelt, dubbed me Missy LeHand, and we got into the pools with those patients and did the best we could, teaching them to exercise and develop the muscles they had that still worked. And eventually, he bought the place, turned it into a private foundation, and patients started coming, and we were able to hire real doctors, real nurses, polio people to exercise with the polio patients. We called them physios. They were physical education majors. And people started getting better and started getting well. And also their spirits were lifted so tremendously. We called it the Warm Spring spirit. This feeling of hope and optimism and things can get better, which is what so many of those patients needed and what so many of us need right now also. Well, I noticed that several of you were mentioning having a little drinky as you watch my talk tonight, and that's lovely. Someone said something about a Manhattan. Actually, FD's favorite is the martini. But we had a children's hour every afternoon about 5 o'clock. It really wasn't for the children, it was for the adults. And even though Prohibition was going on, that never stopped Mr. Roosevelt from having his little drinky. But I remember one afternoon in particular, we had just gotten things going. I was coming out of the kitchen with the martini tray, and there was a knock at the door. Mr. Roosevelt shouted out, "Come in, come in." It was the Baptist preacher from Warm Springs. So I quickly ran back in the kitchen with the martini tray, and for some reason, all the other guests found some reason to come in and talk to me, and they all left a lot happier than when they walked in. And finally, the minister left too. Well, things were going so well at Warm Springs, and I felt Mr. Roosevelt was this close to being able to walk on his own. And then in 1928, the Democratic Party came calling for him. They wanted him to run for governor of New York. I was at his elbow as he was being implored over those very few telephones in Meriwether County, Georgia. Don't you dare do it, FD. Because I knew that if he stopped his intensive therapy, he would lose his chance to walk unassisted. But he dared. He did, and he was elected in a landslide, carried 32 of the 48 states, all but Maine and 5 others, and then a landslide in the Electoral College, of course. You know, down in South Carolina, 98%, 2% were who voted for Hoover. I don't think he had any relatives in that state. But anyway, so we came to the White House in March of 1933. And in 100 days, 15 major pieces of legislation were passed. The banking system was saved. Agricultural reform began. There was an emergency assistance program overseen by Mr. Harry Hopkins. And then Mr. Roosevelt's favorite program was created, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which has sent tens of thousands of young men into the forest of our country to do fire control, to plant trees, to build picnic shelters and roads. It's transforming the landscape. And Mr. Roosevelt loves trees. He likes to say he's a tree farmer for him. And then one other thing he did to help a struggling industry and lift people's spirits was he made it legal to drink low alcohol beer and wine for the first time since 1920. So happy days, eh? Well, that was a year ago that we began the New Deal. We know that many people are still struggling, that the unemployment rate is far too high, that there are people who wonder where their next meal is coming from, and that happy days are not here for anyone at all. But we are still working. We're working very hard, and I can promise you that no one at the White House will rest until that day has come when our country is out of this depression. So at this point, I'm going to change my costume just a bit. I'm going to take off my hat. I think I'll let down my hair. Let's see if I could figure how to remove this corsage. Oh, there's the pin. All right, and I'm going to put on my speakers, my ears, so I can answer questions for you. And I'll tell you just a little bit more about Missy LeHand. Okay, can you all hear me still?
Yes.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay, all right, I'm going to try one more trick and we'll see how it works. I'm going to try to share the screen and get get it to work. Okay, I don't think it's going to work. Anyway, we'll do without that. Well, anyway, I want to tell you what happened to Missy LeHand after her first year in the White House, and then I want to open it up for questioning for you, because I hope you'll have a lot of questions for Missy. Marguerite LeHand came into the White House in 1933 as one of 4 members of what was called the Secretariat. And I know that y'all have already talked about the Secretariat. Louis Howe, who was this really scary, really ugly little man who liked to call himself a medieval gnome. Steve Early, who was the first modern press secretary, actually the first secretary in presidential history, I believe. And then a sort of good-natured fellow named Marvin McIntyre. And Missy was the private secretary. McIntyre handled the appointments, Steve the press, Louis was the political guru, and Missy did everything else. She had the only office adjoining FDR's in the White House, in the West Wing. She knew everybody who went in to see him, what they wanted, what FDR was doing with them. It went over his schedule every morning around his bed in the morning with the other secretaries. And she thought nothing of just going into the office and reminding him that he needed to take his cough medicine, or, you know, this appointment had gone on too long, et cetera, et cetera. He entrusted all of his personal business to her, everything having to do with property owned with Warm Springs. She also handled all of his personal mail, which was thousands of letters. And he got lots of, such as someone to tell him that that was something that Miss Baby's got, a hand embroidered handkerchief that said "Happy Days." Sweet. Over time, Missy had worked for FDR in the governor's mansion also, and had the same arrangement at a bedroom very close to his, on duty all the time. And he handled business. He had an office at the Capitol building, but also he really spent a lot more time handling business from his office in the mansion. So they had a very good working relationship as far as policy, advisors, people they trusted, and she just had a very good understanding of his mind. People said that they were as close as a brother and sister in their thoughts, and she could perceive when it was a good time to bring something to him and when it wasn't. Sometimes she would hold on to mail or reports just until she knew he was in the right mood to talk. She was also his companion in fun. They had this children's hour at the White House every day, usually up in his private Oval Office, which is where his Resolute desk was kept. And he would make the martinis, and everyone would tell jokes or look at cartoons from the newspapers that day, or share gossip. FDR loved to gossip, and it was just lots of silly talk and puns and that kind of thing. Eleanor Roosevelt did not approve of drinking, so sometimes she would come by the children's hour and asked if she could come in. Sometimes FDR would let her, and sometimes he wouldn't, because she was just a wet blanket, to be honest. But Missy liked to cut up and drink and party, so she was a good Catholic girl. So she presided over that. She was also the mistress at the Little White House. Eleanor never got with Jim Crow laws, and she just didn't like it there. So she was happy to relinquish her role as hostess at the Little White House to Missy. And indeed, whenever Eleanor traveled, which was almost constantly, she relinquished her role as White House hostess to Missy. There was a season in Washington that went through the winter, so Eleanor was there for that, but sometimes she would just leave for months at a time, especially in the summer when she went up to Bobella, and Missy was her backup, and they had a very good understanding about what Missy could do and what was outside her purview. One of the things Missy was really good at was introducing to people to FDR who would be useful to him. And one of the best was a man named Tommy Corcoran. He was working for a New Deal agency. He was a very good at getting legislation through. He worked with his roommate Ben Cohen. They were sort of like the Sparkle twins. Ben would write the legislation, Tommy would get it through. But the intro came through Missy, who got a letter of introduction from Felix Frankfurter from Harvard, because Tommy had been one of his star students. And she figured out the best way to introduce him to FDR was to invite him over to sing and play the accordion at the White House, because FDR loved these informal evenings around the piano or singing after dinner, and Tommy had a very fine voice. And after a while, he got so ingratiated with FDR that he started coming around to Missy's office every morning, and he would tell her what the gossip was or what was going on in Capitol Hill, and she'd run in and tell FDR and say, Tommy's out, FDR, and he says this, and this, and FDR would say, oh, send him in, I want to talk to Tommy about that. And that's how he became a very strong member of FDR's inner circle. He got through some of the major legislation, like the Social Security Act, as the White House lobbyist on Capitol Hill. So Missy continued to grow in importance. Louis Howe died in 1936 before the second term began. That was the term where, once again, Maine decided to vote against FDR. There had been a poll done by a magazine called the Literary Guild, and it had said that FDR would lose. In fact, he lost only 2 states, and his campaign manager said famously, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. So that was, Maine never did support FDR in the election. But anyway, the second term began. The court packing scheme happened during that watch. It was a very difficult time. And also things were heating up in Europe. So FDR was walking that very fine line of leading a very isolationist country when his heart was really on helping the British and helping the countries of Europe. Missy was very much in that same camp of wanting to intervene, but they couldn't do anything. So Missy, as I mentioned briefly, had rheumatic fever. She'd gotten some severe heart damage from that. And in the spring of 1941, she had a massive stroke that landed her in a wheelchair, unable to speak. She was really never able to come back to work. She went to Warm Springs for a few months for rehab, came back to her old bedroom in 1942 at the White House. But after an accident in which she set her bed on fire while trying to smoke in bed, they had to get her out of there, and they sent her home to her family in Massachusetts. And that's where she died in the summer of 1944 after having another stroke. After she left the White House, FDR never saw her again. He did write to her. He sent her gifts. Eleanor came to see her. A lot of her friends from Washington did send gifts and came to see her, but she was very lonely and very sad. And it was just a really tough ending. When she had her final stroke and died, FDR was doing an inspection of military bases on the West Coast, so of course he couldn't come to the funeral. Eleanor did, however, and there were 1,200 mourners at her funeral, including Justice Frankfurter, Joseph P. Kennedy, who had been her friend, and many other prominent people. The Roosevelts paid for her grave, paid for her funeral, and they set up an endowment, so they are still paying for the maintenance of her grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston. And the inscription, her devotion to duty, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, 9 months later at the Little White House, FDR suffered from a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died. And it was discovered that when he rewrote his will, he had left half the income of his estate to his wife Eleanor and half to the woman he identified as my friend Marguerite LeHand. He wanted it to go for her medical expenses, which he had been paying all along, and he just wasn't sure that his family would keep that up. If he had died first. Since she died first, it was a moot point. But very interesting. She was the only person outside of his family who was given a bequest of any size other than the life insurance policy that had been taken out on his life that was designated for Warm Springs. So that is the story of Missy LeHand. She died when she was only 47, which was awfully young, but had a very exciting life and a very meaningful life. And at this point, I'm happy to answer your questions about anything you've been wondering about. So, somebody want to unmute and wave?
Hold back.
Okay.
Don't hold back. Peter.
Yeah, please.
I'll start out with one question. Did you spend time in Hyde Park?
Yes, I did. I did quite a bit of research there. Missy's papers, though, had been scattered to the winds. She may know took a lot of papers out of the White House when she left that she really should not have. They wound up in private hands and were eventually donated back to the Roosevelt archives. So there were some LeHand papers with that. She also has two great nieces who have the bulk of her papers, and they were very generous in letting me use them. I found information at the Little White House, including her medical record, which answered a lot of questions that I had and really changed my feeling about her entirely. Trying to think, she had a boyfriend most of the time she was in the White House named William C. Bullitt. He was the ambassador to Paris, and they had a extensive correspondence, and so those papers were available, and I read all of her letters to him, which were very instructive and interesting. Other questions?
Good.
Missy, do you think that you were well prepared for all the things you did in your career, and if so, what prepared you?
I think that the confidence FDR had in Missy was what prepared her, and her loyalty and devotion to him. I mean, like all presidents, he really appreciated loyalty. And a lot of people were elevated into his White House who really didn't have much experience doing stuff. I guess my favorite was Henrietta Nesbitt, the White House kitchen manager and housekeeper manager, who really did nothing except cook food for her family, but that was Eleanor's doing. But she was very capable. You know, she had earned her chops at the governor's mansion. New York was the most populous state in the nation then. So she seemed to know what she was doing. They had a very good team working there. Questions?
I have a question, Kathryn.
Okay.
Within the history of the Roosevelts, there are aspersions and rumors about Missy and the president's relationship. And Elliott Roosevelt
Oh, my.
himself was the one who kind of blew this one out. And I know, and you know.
So
So where does this come
yeah.
from? Where did Elliott Roosevelt come from with this information? Where did he get this and decide that was?
Elliott Roosevelt was the black sheep of the family. He was always out of money. He was married 5 times. He took some things that he noticed. Missy does not talk about the LaRocco, the houseboats. So I can tell you about that. She just never talks about it. So between FDR's infection with polio and his going to Warm Springs, he bought an old houseboat, like a floating tenement, they said. And Eleanor did not want to go spend her winters down there floating around fishing and swatting mosquitoes, so she was happy to send Missy along with her husband as the hostess on his boat. They had all kinds of company all the time. The boat was not big, and they just had company. It was just a floating party boat, and occasionally the children came. And Elliott mentioned seeing Missy sitting in his father's lap in her nightgown and made this big deal about it, that all the children knew that they, had a familial relationship, whatever that means. And actually, when you read about what was going on at the LaRocco, all the women were in their pajamas. They only had people were sleeping all day. It's just what you did. And they just had their party every night. When Elliott made those aspersions in his book, The Roosevelts of Hyde Park, An Untold Story, all of his siblings denounced him. They didn't speak for a long time. And his brother James, in fact, wrote a counter-memoir that challenged a lot of things Elliott said. So I think Elliott did it for money. He did it for shock value, and he made a bestseller of the book. And he got his money, and he ruined Missy's reputation. So when I came into working on the Gatekeeper, I assumed, just from what I'd read, that she was his mistress, his great love and all that. And I came away thinking the opposite, that she was one of the most powerful women in Washington. And the best way to unempower a woman is to say, well, she just slept with the boss. I think that she adored him. I think he adored her. But whether there was any kind of a romantic relationship, I'm not convinced of that at all.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Chuck, go ahead. Heard you first, and then Elaine.
Okay.
What did she do, or what was their relationship at Campobello and in Warm Springs when he was recovering? You said that she was important, very important in helping him to recover.
Yeah. Now, she never came to Campobello when he was stricken. If you've ever seen the movie Sunrise at Campobello, it has her there. Makes her a redhead too, of all things. She had dark hair. She never came to Campobello. And in fact, Roosevelt did not return until the summer of 1933. And she did come then, and she came for other visits. But at the Little White House, she was his partner in starting that, the foundation there, and building the polio spa, as they called it. Very encouraging. She also was one of the people who always had faith that he would get back in politics. Though she thought it was too soon when he ran for governor of New York. So did Louis Howe, and so did Eleanor. So anyway, so she always believed that he could do it. She always believed that he could walk again too, but that just was not going to be in the cards. He came up with that fake walk, leaning on a strong man and a cane, but that was the closest he ever came. Other questions? Someone else had a question?
Elaine had a question.
Yes, I did. First of all, I want to say that I too have read your book. There are 3 of us in our little group from Albion, and Roberta purchased your book for our library. and we're also involved with our
Oh,
library.
nice.
But I wanted to ask you, what was the first seed implanted in your head that you wanted to write about this fabulous woman?
Well, as I put in the acknowledgments, I grew up at the knee of a grandfather who adored FDR. He was what we call a yellow dog Democrat down south. He'd rather vote for a yellow dog than a Republican. I would categorize him as a dead yellow dog Democrat. He'd rather vote for a dead yellow dog than a Republican. And he adored FDR. He had been a young father and husband as the Depression was beginning, really had suffered through it, and things got better when FDR got into office. So that just led me to have a lifelong interest in Roosevelt. And the more I read, the more I noticed this woman, Marguerite LeHand, and I thought, wow, what a fabulous life this woman lived. She lived in the White House. She worked for FDR. I would love to be Marguerite LeHand. And then I found out she died when she was 47 and changed my mind. But now I get to be Marguerite LeHand a lot. And I wanted to read a book about her. Called the FDR library or emailed the library. There was not one. There's not a dedicated biography of Missy LeHand. They said they gave me a couple of other books that had something about her. Doris Kearns Goodwin's book had a lot about her. There's another book that's mostly about Lucy Rutherford, but they all seem to portray Missy as this poor, pathetic, love-starved secretary. And I thought, there's got to be more to this than that. And that's when I started working on the book with the help of the archivist at the Warm Springs Foundation. I got hold of her medical records and discovered that all the times when people were saying she was having nervous breakdowns, it was related to her heart disease. They would put her on digitalis. She was allergic to it. She'd have this toxic reaction and kind of go around the bend, and sometimes have to go to the hospital to recover. And oh, poor Missy, she's had another nervous breakdown. It wasn't. So that really turned everything on its head. And that's when I started realizing that the interesting thing about her was the power she amassed and how wisely she exercised it. Other questions? Uh-oh. Have I lost you?
Okay, sorry.
Oh,
A little bit about her own family.
yeah. Well, she had three siblings, and they were very widely spaced in age. She had a brother who was like 20 years older than she was, a second brother who was a little younger than him, and then a sister who was 2 years older than she was. And they were, like about 10 years apart from the younger brother. Her father was a gardener. He was probably an alcoholic. He had been the coach driver for a wealthy family in Potsdam, and coaching was kind of just a hobby of rich people. It was, and eventually I guess they stopped doing their coaching, didn't need a coachman anymore, and for some reason they moved to Somerville, and he was a gardener. They like to say that he was in real estate, but really the mother was the one that held the family together economically, renting out the rooms and that kind of thing. So she was the breadwinner for the entire family. She had inherited her mother's home, and she died right as the campaign was ending in 1933. And she let her sister live there for free. She helped her sister had two daughters who she adored. She paid for their educations. One of them got a divorce. She paid for the divorce. She was the one who was taking care of everyone. So, and it was the daughters of these two nieces are the ones who I reached out to and reached out to me and collaborated to tell their great aunt's story. So lovely people. Been so fond of them. Other questions?
How was she as a press secretary, and what was her relationship with what we call the media today?
She was not the press secretary. Steve Early was. and she would give interviews, most notably one with the Saturday a lovely conversation with someone. You've enjoyed it very much, and you start writing a story. And that's how Missy was. She was very cagey, and she would just kind of act silly sometimes, and that was how she got around not being nailed down to say anything.
Gene, you had a question?
Yes, Kathryn,
Other
you mentioned
questions?
George Peabody. Would
Mhm.
you know if he had any contact in Portland, Maine?
Who was this?
Sorry?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the name.
You mentioned George Peabody.
Oh,
earlier.
George Foster Peabody. I don't know. He was from Columbus, Georgia. And I'm not sure what his money was in, but he had gone to Harvard with FDR, and he was the part owner of the Meriwether Inn. But I don't know about Portland.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Anybody else? Oh, I have a, hang on, I got well, Pat Paradis says he's pleased to know that some of your papers are at the Roosevelt Library. We have FDR to, I'm going to thank for starting the presidential libraries.
Yeah.
So that's
Actually, I read today in a really interesting book called, of all things, Dead Presidents, that the first presidential library was done by Rutherford, the family of Rutherford B. Hayes, but it was not done purposely to be under the National Archives like FDR. So I'd never heard that. I thought FDR came up with the idea, but apparently he had heard about Hayes's library. Interesting, huh? Let me mention about, if you're interested in a copy of the Gatekeeper, you can get it as a paperback on, Amazon. That bad place. You can get it as a Kindle from Amazon. If anyone is interested in a signed first edition, hardback first edition, I have some of those, and you can arrange with Mike, get my address and all that. Just send me a check for $28 and your address, and I'll send it back to you signed and inscribed.
find mine.
And if I can also give a little commercial for my newest book. It's called Gertie, The Fabulous Life of Gertrude Sanford LeJeune. The subtitle is Heiress, Explorer, Socialite, Spy. And this is a lady who had a life like you would not believe. She was a very rich heiress from upstate New York. Her father was in the carpet business. She lived on a plantation outside Charleston. She was into horses, golf, tennis, partying. She knew everybody. But one of the really interesting aspects of her life was when she was in her 40s, she went to work for the OSS during World War II, the spy agency. And she was on what amounts to a joyride to see the front in France when she and 3 others were picked up by the Germans, imprisoned, and shot at, and she spent the last 6 months of the war as a POW. So on my Facebook page every day, I have been posting videos called Gertie's Coronavirus Crisis Survival Tips, all based on how she got through that 6 months of imprisonment. So I would invite you to go check them out. My Facebook is just Kathryn Smith, Kathryn Smith. And follow along is to always wear red lipstick. And the one I posted today is how to wear red lipstick and wear a mask and smudge it.
Any other questions from anybody?
I have one more. Kathryn,
Okay.
how long did it take you to put all of this together? How did you start? And the process, because you're now in your second book.
Yeah. And, this was the first time I'd done anything like this. My background was in newspaper journalism. Then I ran nonprofits for a long time. And I kind of went back to my journalism roots. So I don't know, I didn't read any books. I didn't take any classes. I just started just acting like a reporter and digging stuff up. I worked on the book for about a year and a few months, in addition to a lot of other writing and editing projects.
Okay. Wow.
And then with all the dumb luck in the world, I got a New York agent who sold it to Simon & Schuster. And I spent another year finishing the book, and then it took Simon & Schuster another year to get it out. It takes a
Wow.
very long time for a
Okay.
New York publisher to do
Okay.
a book. And I just tried to, I guess I almost over-documented the book because I'm not a scholar. I'm a journalist, and people have just remarked on the how well documented it is and how interesting the footnotes are, the endnotes are, and I really appreciate that. And I did the same thing with my book on Gertie. Fortunately for me, all of Gertie's papers, in fact, are at the College of Charleston Library in Charleston. But in the case of Gertie, I also did a lot of site visits. I followed her trail as a POW through Germany. And I started out, as she did, at the Ritz Bar in Paris. Anyone want to guess what a martini cost there? Any guesses?
I don't know.
$12.
$35.
Wow. Wow.
It's called the Clean Dirty Martini. It's really good. But anyway, I went to a couple of the places where she was held as a POW. And then she escaped on a train over the Swiss border. So I got on the train and rode over the Swiss border just to get
Wow.
a feel for what it might have been like. So
Wow.
I like to do the site visits just as I did with Missy. I have not been to Campobello, which is on my list of places to go whenever I get to travel again. But I did go to her home in Massachusetts, and just kind of stood outside on the sidewalk. And the neighborhood where she lived, I went to visit her grave, which was when it first started seeming to me as if she
Okay.
were truly dead. Went up to Hyde Park, spent a lot of time in Warren with her nieces.
Okay.
Any more essays?
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
What was Gertie's last name?
LeGendre, Legendre. Spell that again, Legendre. I pronounced it Legendre for the first year I was working on the research and had to be politely corrected by Gertie's former secretary. This Legendre. She was married to a man from New Orleans. Her maiden name was Sanford. And the Sanford is Bigelow Sanford Carpet Company is the company that her father owned. She was also a big game hunter and led scientific expeditions into jungles and deserts, along with her husband, Sidney. And whenever someone asked him why he would bring his wife to such a dangerous place, he'd say, "Me bring her, she's bringing me." It's quite a gal.
Any other
And
questions?
that book is available also through booksellers, Amazon. There's a new website called bookshop.org. It's a nonprofit, but when you buy through that, it helps support local bookstores. So I'm always recommending that. You'll get it faster if you order through Evening Post Books, the publisher. That's evepostbooks.com.
You mentioned that Eleanor and Missy had a clear understanding of what the limits were. And I wondered what those limits were and anything else you might say about their relationship.
About their relationship. Eleanor was interesting in that she treated the adult staff like they were her children. She was only 9 years older than Missy. FDR was 13 years older, but she was saying, they would both say that, "Oh, you good, you good children," and he called himself Papa, and she'd fuss over them when they were sick and that kind of thing. So Missy knew what she could do. There's certain things you can do when you're filling in for somebody, but some of the other people who tried to do that with Eleanor, even her own daughter, she would just get enraged because they had, dared to set out the place cards at a dinner table or something like that. But she was accepted as a member of the family. I think it's interesting that when the King and Queen of England came to America, they had several formal dinners they had, and the first thing they did was a luncheon at the White House, and Missy was the only member of the White House staff who was included in that luncheon. So
Thank
all the
you.
Roosevelt children were. Other
So
questions?
I have a question.
Okay, Peter.
To sum it all up,
Uh-huh.
was Missy more important as the typist or as the confidant or as the party girl? Which is the part that
I think it's the confidant, not at all the typist. She actually wasn't a very good typist. She had 50 people to type for her. Grace Tully was a much better stenographer, but it was as the confidant that she was the most important to him.
And
I heard
if you
y'all-
met her, if you met her today,
Uh-huh.
would you think you would be friends with her, or do you think that she'd be a different personality than you are?
I think I would be friends with her, and I think that I felt a lot of sympathy with her. I'm like her in that I love organizing and running things. I love to be on the inside. I felt a lot like that. Now with Gertie, I had nothing in common with her at all. I would have loved to come to one of her parties, but you know, you're talking about someone who would go out on a walk with her plantation and bring a gun along in case she came across a copperhead. Oh my God, I'm terrified of snakes. I've never held a loaded gun in my life. I mean, I would never have done the things she did, but I think she's fascinating.
Okay.
Would you like to know what I'm working on now? I'm working on a book about prohibition in the South. And it's interesting because the South went dry before the rest of the country did, and everything that went wrong during American Prohibition had already happened in the South and continued to happen into the 1960s. We were still making moonshine on a regular basis. So it's going to be a lot of fun to read. I think I'm going to do it as a combination travel memoir, so you can go on your own Prohibition expedition in places like Louisville and Savannah, and then tell the history too. And that includes all kinds of crazy women like Carrie Nation. So that's my next book.
I'll bet you the research would be more fun for that one too.
And I've spent a lot of time in bars, I must say, and yeah, learned how to make all kinds of drinks like the scofflaw and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Anyone else?
This was great.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad it worked out. I'm so sorry I didn't get to meet you all in person, but maybe another time.
Great, and we'll do it another time. And we appreciate you taking the time to join this crew. This is the people I deal with every week. This motley crew of people.
I think you're lucky.
We have a good time.
I can tell. I can tell. And they deal with you.
Hey. I told Kathryn the other day, like, I can tell that my like 9 times great grandmother was born about 10 miles from where Kathryn lives. So
isn't that funny? Yeah, it's a small world. But I've enjoyed talking to Mike leading up to this, and I know y'all have had to been enjoying him. He is a fount of knowledge about the Roosevelts. So have fun. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kathryn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Friday class on Friday,
Bye.
and the Monday class next week.
Okay.
Friday, Mike.
Stay out of trouble, everybody.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, that was fun.